The Arizona sun was brutal that Tuesday afternoon, turning the highway into a ribbon of shimmering heat. Officer Brandon Cole had been on duty for nearly 8 hours, and his shift still had 2 more to go. The air conditioning in his patrol car was barely working, and sweat kept dripping into his eyes despite the bandana he'd tied around his forehead. He was tired, irritable, and counting the minutes until he could clock out and head home. That's when he spotted the black sedan. It was nice, really nice. The kind of car that probably cost more than he made in a year. Brandon's radar gun beeped. 58 miles per hour in a 55 zone. Technically speeding, though most cops would have let it slide. But something about that expensive car rubbed Brandon the wrong way. Maybe it was the heat. Maybe it was his mood. Or maybe it was something else entirely. Something he wouldn't want to admit even to himself. He flipped on his lights and pulled out onto the highway. The sedan didn't stop immediately, which annoyed him even more. It continued for another quarter mile before finally pulling onto the shoulder. Brandon radioed in the stop and approached the vehicle, his hand resting near his belt out of habit. Through the tinted window he could see the driver was a woman. She was on her phone, talking to someone in a low professional voice. She was wearing a dark blazer, the kind people wear to important business meetings. Her hair was pulled back neatly, and even from where he stood, Brandon could tell she was someone who took herself seriously. He tapped on the window with his knuckle, harder than necessary. The woman held up one finger, a gesture that meant just a minute. That single gesture made Brandon's blood boil. He knocked again, louder this time. License and registration. Now, he barked, his voice sharp and commanding. The woman glanced at him and he saw a flicker of annoyance cross her face before she returned to her call. "I need to go," she said into the phone. "Something's come up. We'll continue this in 20 minutes. She ended the call and pressed the button to lower the window fully. "Good afternoon, officer," she said calmly. "I apologize for the delay. I was coordinating a time-sensitive work matter." Brandon wasn't interested in her excuses. "License and registration," he repeated, his tone making it clear he didn't care about her work matters or anything else. The woman reached for her purse slowly, keeping her hands visible. She pulled out her wallet and retrieved her driver's license, then opened the glove compartment for the registration. As she handed the documents to Brandon, she spoke again. "I realize I may have been slightly over the speed limit. I'm running late for a critical meeting at the federal building downtown. If you could please process this quickly, I would appreciate it." Brandon looked at the license. Her name was Rebecca Chen. The address showed she lived in Virginia. The car was a rental. Everything about this situation irritated him more. Some out-of-state government worker, probably in town for a conference, thinking she could speed through his jurisdiction and get away with it because she had an important meeting. "Ma'am, the speed limit is 55. You were doing 58, he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "I don't care if you're late for tea with the president. You follow the law like everyone else." Rebecca's jaw tightened slightly, but she kept her composure. "I understand, officer. I'm not trying to get out of a ticket. I'm simply asking if we can handle this efficiently. I have federal obligations that require my immediate attention." "Federal obligations," Brandon repeated, mocking her tone. "Let me guess. You're some kind of big shot, right? Well, out here I'm the law, and right now you're just another speeder who thinks the rules don't apply to her." He walked back to his patrol car with her documents, taking his time deliberately. He ran her license through the system. Clean record. No warrants. No prior violations. Everything checked out perfectly. This only frustrated him more. He sat in his car for several minutes watching her in the rearview mirror. She was checking her watch, clearly anxious about the time. Brandon finally got out and approached the vehicle again, but instead of simply writing the ticket, he decided to push things further. Something about her calm, professional demeanor made him want to knock her down a peg. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step out of the vehicle," he said, his tone suddenly more serious. Rebecca looked confused. "I'm sorry, what, why?" "Just step out of the vehicle, please," Brandon repeated, his hand moving to rest on his belt again. A subtle threat. "Officer, I don't understand. I was 3 miles over the speed limit. Why do you need me to exit the vehicle?" Rebecca's voice remained calm, but there was an edge to it now. "I smell alcohol." Brandon lied smoothly. "I need to conduct a field sobriety test." Rebecca's eyes widened. "That's absolutely false. I haven't had anything to drink. I've been in meetings all day. Step out of the vehicle now." Brandon's voice was harder now, more aggressive. Rebecca hesitated for a moment, then carefully unbuckled her seatbelt and opened the door. She stepped out onto the dusty shoulder of the highway, the afternoon heat hitting her immediately. Cars whizzed past them, their drivers rubbernecking to see what was happening. She stood there in her business suit and heels, looking completely out of place on the side of the desert highway. Brandon could see she was holding back her anger, trying to stay professional. That made him want to push harder. "I'm telling you right now, I have not been drinking," Rebecca said firmly. "This is completely unnecessary, and frankly, it's beginning to feel like harassment." "Oh, now I'm harassing you?" Brandon laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You know what I think? I think you're one of those people who comes into town, flashes some government badge around, and expects everyone to bow down." "Well, not here. Not with me." Rebecca took a deep breath, clearly trying to maintain control of the situation. "Officer, I would like your badge number, please." That did it. Brandon's face flushed red with anger. Nobody asked for his badge number. Nobody questioned his authority. Before Rebecca could react, he grabbed her arm roughly and spun her around, pushing her against the hot metal of her car. "You want my badge number?" he hissed near her ear. "How about you show me some respect first?" Rebecca tried to pull away, but Brandon held her firmly, pressing her against the vehicle. The metal was scorching from hours in the sun, and she gasped from the heat against her cheek. "Officer, you are making a serious mistake," Rebecca said, her voice strained but still controlled. "Let go of me right now." "Or what?" Brandon challenged, twisting her arm behind her back. He wasn't thinking clearly anymore. All he could feel was the anger and resentment that had been building all day, all week, maybe all year. This woman represented everything that frustrated him about his job, about his life. Rebecca's forehead scraped against the car as Brandon pressed harder. She felt something warm trickle down her face and realized she was bleeding. The situation had crossed a line and they both knew it, but Brandon seemed unable to stop himself now, his pride and anger overriding his training and common sense. "You're going to regret this," Rebecca said quietly. And there was something in her voice now. Not a threat exactly, but a promise. A certainty. Brandon reached for his handcuffs, his hands shaking slightly as the reality of what he was doing started to creep into his consciousness. But he'd gone too far to back down now. At least that's what he told himself as he heard the sound of another patrol car pulling up behind them, its tires crunching on the gravel shoulder. Officer Lisa Martinez stepped out of her patrol car and immediately knew something was wrong. She'd been monitoring the radio traffic from Brandon's stop, and his tone had been off from the beginning. Too aggressive, too personal. She'd worked with Brandon for 3 years, and lately she'd noticed a change in him. More bitter, more confrontational. She'd meant to talk to him about it, but there never seemed to be a right time. Now as she approached the scene, she could see Brandon had a woman pinned against her car. There was blood on the woman's face. Lisa's training kicked in immediately, and her hand instinctively moved near her weapon, though not to draw it. This wasn't a threat situation. This was something else entirely. Something worse. "Brandon, what's going on here?" Lisa called out, keeping her voice steady and professional. She needed to de-escalate this situation fast before it got any worse than it already was. Brandon's head snapped around and Lisa saw confusion and anger in his eyes. He was breathing hard and his face was flushed red from more than just the heat. This woman was speeding and she refused to cooperate with a field sobriety test, he said, his voice defensive and too loud. Lisa looked at the woman pressed against the car. Despite the uncomfortable position and the blood trickling from her forehead, the woman's eyes were calm. Too calm. Lisa had seen that look before during her time in the army. It was the look of someone with training, someone who knew how to stay in control even in the worst situations. "Ma'am, are you okay?" Lisa asked gently, moving closer. "I've been better," Rebecca replied, her voice tight but controlled. "This officer pulled me over for going 3 miles over the speed limit. He then falsely accused me of drinking and proceeded to assault me when I asked for his badge number." Brandon's grip on Rebecca's arm tightened. She's lying. She was combative from the start. Lisa glanced at Brandon's patrol car. The dash cam would have recorded everything. She made a mental note of that. "Brandon, let her go. Right now." "She needs to be taught some respect," Brandon muttered, but his voice had lost some of its earlier conviction. He was starting to realize he'd crossed a line. "Brandon," Lisa said more firmly. "Release her." "That's not a request." Reluctantly, Brandon let go and stepped back. Rebecca straightened slowly, wincing as she moved. She touched her forehead gently and looked at the blood on her fingers. Lisa could see bruises already forming on Rebecca's wrists where Brandon had gripped her. "Ma'am, I'm Officer Martinez. I need to ask you some questions," Lisa said, pulling out her notebook. "First, are you injured anywhere else besides your head?" "My face and arm," Rebecca said, touching her cheek where it had been pressed against the hot metal. "There was already a red mark there, but I'll be fine. What I need is for this officer to be held accountable for what just happened." Brandon scoffed. "Held accountable? For doing my job? You were speeding and being uncooperative." "I asked for your badge number," Rebecca said, turning to face him directly now. "That's my right as a citizen, and you responded by assaulting me." Lisa held up a hand. "Everyone needs to calm down." "Ma'am, can I see your license and registration, please?" "He has my license," Rebecca said, nodding toward Brandon. "And my registration is in the car." Lisa turned to Brandon. "Give me her documents." Brandon reluctantly pulled the license from his pocket and handed it over. Lisa looked at it, noting the Virginia address. Then Rebecca handed her the registration from inside the car. Everything seemed normal, just a routine traffic stop that had spiraled completely out of control. "Ma'am, do you have any other identification on you?" Lisa asked, something in her gut telling her there was more to this story. Rebecca hesitated for just a moment, and Lisa caught it. That brief pause told her everything she needed to know. This wasn't just some random businesswoman. There was something else going on here. "I do," Rebecca said carefully. "It's in my jacket pocket. I'm going to reach for it slowly, okay?" Lisa nodded, watching carefully. Rebecca reached into her inside jacket pocket and pulled out a black leather credential case. The kind that federal agents carry. Lisa's stomach dropped. "Oh no," she thought. "Please don't be what I think this is." Rebecca opened the case and held it out for Lisa to see. Lisa took it, and her face went completely pale as she read the identification inside. Her hands actually started to shake. "Oh my God," Lisa whispered. She looked up at Rebecca, then at Brandon, then back at the credentials in her hand. "Oh my God, Brandon, do you have any idea what you just did?" Brandon looked confused and angry. "What are you talking about?" Lisa turned the credentials around so Brandon could see them. "This is Rebecca Chen. She's not just some businesswoman, Brandon. She's the Director of Immigration and Customs Enforcement. She's the head of ICE, the entire agency." The color drained from Brandon's face so fast that Lisa thought he might pass out. He staggered backward, his mouth opening and closing, but no words coming out. His hands started trembling and he looked like he might be sick. "That's not possible," Brandon finally managed to say, his voice barely a whisper. "She can't be. She was just speeding. She was just doing 3 miles over the speed limit on her way to a federal meeting." Lisa finished for him, her own voice shaking now. "And you assaulted her. You assaulted a federal director, Brandon." Rebecca took the credentials back from Lisa and tucked them away. "Officer Martinez, I appreciate you intervening when you did. Things could have gotten much worse." Lisa nodded, trying to process what was happening. She'd seen officers make mistakes before, but this was beyond anything she'd ever witnessed. Brandon had just destroyed his entire career, possibly his freedom, in one afternoon of bad judgment and worse temper. "Ma'am, I need to document your injuries," Lisa said, pulling out her phone. "And we need to preserve all the evidence from this stop. The dash cam footage, everything. I have my own recording as well," Rebecca said, pulling out her phone. "I activated it when Officer Cole began acting aggressively. I have the entire encounter documented." Brandon made a strangled sound. He looked like he was going to be sick. "I didn't know," he said weakly. "You didn't tell me who you were." Rebecca looked at him with cold eyes. "I shouldn't have to tell you who I am for you to treat me with basic human dignity and respect. Every person you stop on this highway deserves to be treated fairly, regardless of whether they're a federal director or a grocery store clerk. The badge and gun you carry are a responsibility, not a license to abuse people." Those words hit Brandon like physical blows. He knew she was right. He also knew his life was over. Everything he'd worked for, his career, his reputation, his pension, all of it was gone. And it was his own fault. Lisa was already on her radio calling for a supervisor. "This is Unit 12. I need a supervisor at my location immediately. We have a situation that requires command staff presence." She paused, then added quietly, "It's serious, very serious." Within minutes, the quiet highway shoulder was about to become the center of a storm. More patrol cars were already heading their way. The chief of police had been notified, and somewhere in Washington, federal agents were being briefed about an assault on their director. Brandon stood there frozen, watching his entire world collapse around him. And all because he'd let his ego and his temper get the better of him on a hot Tuesday afternoon. The first supervisor to arrive was Sergeant Tom Williams, a 20-year veteran who'd seen just about everything in his career. Or so he thought. When Lisa briefed him on what had happened, he actually had to ask her to repeat herself. Then he looked at Rebecca's credentials for himself, his face going through the same transformation that Lisa's had. Shock, disbelief, and then horror. Sweet Jesus, Tom muttered under his breath. He looked at Brandon, who was sitting on the ground now, his back against his patrol car, his head in his hands. Cole, what were you thinking? Brandon didn't answer. He couldn't. What could he possibly say? That he'd been having a bad day? That the heat had gotten to him? That he'd let his pride turn him into exactly the kind of cop he'd once promised himself he'd never become? Tom turned his attention to Rebecca, who was sitting in Lisa's patrol car with the door open, accepting a bottle of water. The cut on her forehead had stopped bleeding, but it would definitely need attention. The bruises on her wrists were getting darker by the minute. Ma'am, I'm Sergeant Williams. On behalf of the Phoenix Police Department, I want to apologize for what happened here today, Tom said, his voice heavy with genuine remorse. This is not how we train our officers. This is not who we are. Rebecca looked at him with tired eyes. Sergeant, I've worked in law enforcement my entire adult life. I know that most officers are good people trying to do a difficult job, but I also know that incidents like this happen far too often, and they usually happen to people who don't have the credentials or the platform to hold anyone accountable. Her words hung in the air. Tom knew exactly what she meant. How many other people had Brandon treated this way? People without federal credentials. People without the power to fight back. People whose complaints would be dismissed or buried. The dashcam footage will be preserved, Tom assured her. Nothing will be deleted or altered. I give you my word on that. I appreciate that, Rebecca said. But I also have my own recording, and I'll be filing a formal complaint through federal channels. This isn't just about me, Sergeant. This is about systemic accountability. More vehicles were arriving now. The police chief's SUV pulled up, followed by 2 more patrol cars. Then came a black sedan with federal plates. Rebecca's security detail had finally caught up. 2 agents in dark suits emerged from the vehicle, their faces grim as they assessed the situation. Director Chen, the taller agent said, approaching quickly. Are you all right? We were running surveillance from a distance and lost visual for a few minutes. By the time we realized there was a problem, you'd already handled it. I'm fine, Agent Morrison, Rebecca replied, though I could use some ice for this headache. The arrival of federal agents changed the entire atmosphere. Suddenly, this wasn't just a local police matter anymore. This was a federal incident involving the assault of a high-ranking government official. The implications were massive. Police Chief David Patterson was a political animal who'd climbed the ranks by knowing how to read situations and respond appropriately. One look at the scene told him everything he needed to know. He walked directly to Rebecca, his expression grave. Director Chen, I'm Chief Patterson. I cannot express how sorry I am about what happened today, he said. I want to assure you that we will conduct a full and transparent investigation into this incident. Rebecca stood up, meeting his eyes directly. Chief Patterson, I'm going to be very clear with you. This officer pulled me over for a minor traffic violation, and then escalated the situation into a violent confrontation without cause. He falsely accused me of drinking. He ignored my attempts to de-escalate, and when I asked for his badge number, which is my right, he assaulted me. This is on camera. Multiple cameras. The chief nodded slowly. I understand. Officer Cole will be placed on immediate administrative leave pending investigation. I want you to know that we take this extremely seriously. I hope you do, Rebecca said, because I'm not the only person this has happened to. I'm just the one with enough power to make sure something actually gets done about it. By now, news helicopters were circling overhead. Someone had been monitoring police scanners and picked up on the unusual radio traffic. The media was about to have a field day with this story. Federal director assaulted by local cop. The headlines would write themselves. Lisa was documenting everything methodically. She photographed Rebecca's injuries from multiple angles. She secured the dashcam footage from Brandon's vehicle. She wrote down every detail she could remember from the moment she arrived on the scene. She knew this case would be scrutinized by dozens of people, maybe hundreds. Everything had to be perfect. Brandon was still sitting on the ground, but now 2 other officers were standing near him. Not quite guarding him, but close. He'd already been read his rights, though no formal charges had been filed yet. That would come later, after statements were taken and evidence was reviewed. But everyone knew it was coming. Agent Morrison was on his phone, speaking in low, urgent tones. Rebecca could hear fragments of the conversation. Federal prosecutors were being briefed. The FBI Civil Rights Division was being notified. The Department of Justice wanted updates. This incident was going to ripple through multiple agencies and departments. A paramedic unit arrived and checked Rebecca's injuries. The cut on her forehead wasn't deep enough to require stitches, but they cleaned and bandaged it. They documented the bruises and took her blood pressure, which was elevated but not dangerously so. They strongly recommended she go to the hospital for a full examination, but Rebecca declined. She had work to do. "Ma'am, are you sure you don't want to press charges right now?" Tom asked her quietly. "We can arrest Cole immediately if you want." Rebecca shook her head. "I want this done properly through official channels. I want every piece of evidence documented. I want every procedure followed to the letter. Because when this goes to trial, I want there to be absolutely no question about what happened here and why Officer Cole needs to be held accountable." Tom respected that. It would have been easy for Rebecca to abuse her authority, to demand immediate action, to throw her weight around. Instead, she was insisting on following the same procedures that any other citizen would have to follow. It made the situation even more damning for Brandon. The chief was giving orders now. The entire stretch of highway was being treated as a crime scene. More officers were arriving to document everything and control traffic. Internal affairs investigators were being called in. The union representative for the Police Officers Association was on his way, though everyone knew there wasn't much he could do to help Brandon in this situation. Lisa approached Rebecca one more time. "Ma'am, I need to ask you something. And please know I'm not trying to defend what Brandon did because there's no defense for it. But did you identify yourself as a federal official during the initial stop?" Rebecca considered the question carefully. "I told him I was on my way to federal business at the ice field office. I told him I was a government employee, but no, I didn't specifically show him my credentials until after the assault had already occurred. And do you know why? Because I wanted to be treated like any other citizen. I shouldn't need federal credentials to be treated with basic respect and dignity." Lisa nodded. She understood. And she knew that Rebecca was absolutely right. The badge that said ICE Director shouldn't matter. Brandon should have treated her properly regardless of who she was. As the sun started to sink lower in the Arizona sky, the scene on the highway was still bustling with activity. Rebecca was finally allowed to leave, escorted by her security detail to complete her original mission at the federal building. Brandon was taken to the station, no longer as a police officer but as a suspect in a federal assault case. And Lisa stood there on the shoulder of the highway, watching it all unfold, thinking about how one bad decision can change everything, how years of service can be erased in minutes, how power without accountability leads to moments exactly like this one. She thought about all the traffic stops she'd conducted in her career, and she promised herself that she would never, ever let her ego or her temper turn her into what Brandon had become. The story hit the news before Brandon even made it back to the station. By the time his patrol car pulled into the department parking lot, camera crews were already setting up outside. The headlines were everywhere. Local officer assaults ICE director during traffic stop. Federal official attacked by Phoenix cop. The videos were spreading across social media like wildfire. Shared thousands of times within the first hour, Brandon's wife called him 17 times that evening. He couldn't bring himself to answer. How do you explain to the person you love that you've thrown away everything? That your kids might grow up with a father in prison? That the house, the car, the life you built together might all disappear because you couldn't control your temper for 10 minutes? He sat in an interrogation room at his own police station, a place he'd been 1,000 times before. But now he was on the wrong side of the table. His union representative, a man named Phil who'd been defending officers for 20 years, sat beside him with a grim expression. "Brandon, I'm going to be straight with you," Phil said quietly. "This is bad. This is as bad as it gets. You assaulted a federal director. That's not something I can make go away with a good lawyer and some negotiating. I didn't know who she was, Brandon said weakly, repeating the same excuse he'd been clinging to all afternoon. Phil shook his head. That's not a defense, and you know it. You shouldn't have put your hands on her regardless of who she was. The fact that she's a federal director just makes it worse. Much worse, the video evidence was damning. The dash cam footage showed everything. Rebecca being polite and cooperative. Brandon's aggressive escalation. The false accusation about alcohol. And then the assault, clear as day. There was no way to spin it. No way to claim it was taken out of context or that Brandon had been defending himself. But it wasn't just the dash cam. Rebecca's phone recording captured audio that the dash cam hadn't picked up clearly. Brandon's mocking tone. His comments about federal bureaucrats. His refusal to listen to reason. And most damaging of all, his laugh when Rebecca tried to warn him he was making a mistake. Internal affairs moved fast. They had to. The media attention was intense and the department needed to show they were taking this seriously. Within 48 hours, they'd interviewed Lisa, reviewed all the footage, and spoken with witnesses who'd driven past the scene. Every piece of evidence pointed to the same conclusion. Brandon had abused his authority and assaulted a citizen without justification. The federal investigation moved even faster. FBI agents interviewed Rebecca in detail, documenting every moment of the encounter. They examined her injuries, took photographs, and collected her clothing as evidence. They pulled Brandon's personnel file and found 3 prior complaints about excessive force, all of which had been dismissed or resulted in minor disciplinary actions. A pattern was emerging. Rebecca herself became the center of a media storm. Reporters camped outside the Icefield office, hoping for a statement. News anchors debated whether she should have identified herself sooner. Talk show hosts discussed police accountability and federal authority. Everyone had an opinion about what happened on that Arizona highway, but Rebecca stayed focused. She gave one carefully worded statement to the press. I was assaulted while going about my duties as a federal official. This incident highlights the need for better training and accountability in law enforcement at all levels. I have faith that justice will be served through the proper legal channels. She didn't mention Brandon by name. She didn't call for his head. She simply stated the facts and moved on. But behind the scenes, she was working with federal prosecutors to ensure that this case was handled properly. Not because she wanted revenge, but because she knew that if someone in her position couldn't get justice, what hope did ordinary citizens have? Brandon's life unraveled quickly. He was terminated from the police department within a week. The chief held a press conference announcing the decision, calling Brandon's actions unacceptable and contrary to everything we stand for as a department. His pension was in jeopardy. His health insurance was gone, and the legal bills were already piling up. His wife finally got through to him on the 5th day. The conversation was brief and painful. She was taking the kids to stay with her mother for a while. She needed time to think. She couldn't look at him the same way anymore. The man she'd married wouldn't have done what he did on that highway. Meanwhile, the police union was distancing itself from Brandon's case. Usually, they defended officers vigorously, arguing that split-second decisions in dangerous situations shouldn't be second-guessed. But this wasn't a split-second decision in a dangerous situation. This was a routine traffic stop that Brandon had turned violent through his own choices. Even the union couldn't defend that. Lisa found herself in the spotlight too, though for different reasons. She was being praised for her intervention, for stopping the situation before it got even worse. The department wanted to use her as an example of good policing. But Lisa felt conflicted. She kept thinking about all the times she'd seen Brandon getting more aggressive, more bitter, and she'd said nothing. Could she have prevented this if she'd spoken up sooner? She visited Brandon once against the advice of her sergeant. They met at a coffee shop near his house. He looked terrible. He'd lost weight. His eyes were hollow. He hadn't shaved in days. Why did you come? Brandon asked, stirring his coffee without drinking it. I don't know, Lisa admitted. Maybe because we were partners once. Maybe because I feel like I should have seen this coming. Brandon shook his head. This isn't your fault. It's mine. I knew what I was doing was wrong, even while I was doing it. I just couldn't stop myself. It was like watching someone else make all these terrible decisions, except that someone was me. What happened to you? Lisa asked. You used to be a good cop. You used to care about doing things right. Brandon was quiet for a long time. I don't know. Maybe it was the job. Maybe it was everything else in my life. Maybe I was always like this and just finally stopped hiding it. He looked up at her with red-rimmed eyes. Does it matter? I destroyed everything. My career, my family, that woman's sense of safety. All because I couldn't handle someone holding up a finger and asking me to wait a minute. The federal charges came down 3 weeks after the incident. Assault on a federal official. Deprivation of rights under color of law. 2 felony counts that carried serious prison time. Brandon's lawyer, paid for with money he didn't have, tried to negotiate a plea deal. But the prosecutors weren't in a generous mood. This case was too public, too clear-cut. Rebecca continued her work at ICE, though she noticed changes in how people treated her. Some officers and agents seemed afraid of her now, worried that any minor mistake might result in federal charges. That wasn't what she wanted. She didn't want people to fear her authority. She wanted them to respect everyone they encountered regardless of their position or power. She gave a speech at a law enforcement conference a month after the incident. The room was packed. Everyone wanted to hear what she had to say. What happened to me on that highway could have happened to anyone, she told the crowd. The only difference is that I had the resources and the platform to seek justice. But how many others experience similar treatment and have no recourse? How many traffic stops escalate unnecessarily? How many people are treated with disrespect or violence simply because an officer is having a bad day? The room was silent. Every person there knew she was right. We need to do better, Rebecca continued. Not just as individual officers, but as a system. We need better training, better accountability, better support for officers who are struggling. Because when we fail to hold each other accountable, we fail everyone. We fail the communities we serve. We fail the oath we took, and we fail ourselves. Brandon watched that speech on the news from his nearly empty apartment. Most of his furniture was gone, sold to pay lawyers. His wife had filed for separation. His kids barely spoke to him, and he had a trial date looming that would likely end with him in prison. He watched Rebecca speak about accountability and justice, and he realized something. She wasn't his enemy. She never had been. His enemy had been his own pride, his own anger, his own inability to treat another human being with basic decency. And that enemy had cost him everything. The trial was scheduled for 6 months after the incident, but it never happened. 3 weeks before the court date, Brandon's lawyer came to him with a plea agreement. The federal prosecutors were offering a deal. Plead guilty to assault on a federal official, accept 18 months in federal prison, 3 years of supervised probation, and permanent revocation of his law enforcement certification. In exchange, they dropped the civil rights violation charge. Brandon sat in his lawyer's office looking at the papers in front of him. His hands were shaking. 18 months. It could have been worse. The civil rights charge alone carried up to 10 years, but 18 months still meant missing his daughter's high school graduation, missing birthdays and holidays, coming out with a felony record that would follow him for the rest of his life. What if we go to trial? Brandon asked, though he already knew the answer. His lawyer, a tired-looking man named Kenneth, shook his head. Brandon, we've been through this. The evidence is overwhelming. The dash cam footage, the phone recording, the witness testimony from Officer Martinez, the physical evidence of Director Chen's injuries. If we go to trial, you'll lose, and the judge will give you the maximum sentence. Maybe 5 years, maybe more. This deal is the best option you have. Brandon signed the papers. What choice did he have? He'd thrown away his chance to fight when he put his hands on Rebecca that day on the highway. Everything that followed was just the consequence of that single moment of rage and pride. The sentencing hearing was brief. Brandon stood before the judge in a suit that didn't fit him anymore. He'd lost so much weight that his clothes hung loose on his frame. Rebecca was there, sitting in the gallery with her security detail. She didn't look angry or vindictive. She just looked sad, like she was watching a waste of human potential. The judge, a woman named Barbara Hernandez who'd been on the federal bench for 15 years, looked at Brandon with disappointment more than anger. Mr. Cole, you were given a badge and a gun and the authority to enforce the law. That authority comes with tremendous responsibility. You were supposed to protect people, to serve your community. Instead, you abused that authority in the worst possible way. You assaulted a citizen who was guilty of nothing more than going 3 miles over the speed limit. Brandon kept his eyes down, unable to look at the judge or at Rebecca. The court accepts your guilty plea, Judge Hernandez continued. You are hereby sentenced to 18 months in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised probation. You are permanently prohibited from working in law enforcement in any capacity. You will also pay restitution for Director Chen's medical expenses and court costs. And just like that, it was over. Brandon was led away by federal marshals. He'd report to prison in 2 weeks. Time enough to get his affairs in order, to say goodbye to his children one more time, to pack up the few belongings he had left. Rebecca left the courthouse through a side entrance, avoiding the media circus outside. She'd given her statement to the prosecutors. She'd testified in the pretrial hearings. She'd done everything the justice system required of her. Now she just wanted to move forward. But moving forward meant something different than going back to how things were. The incident had changed her. She'd always known that police misconduct happened, had seen the statistics and read the reports, but experiencing it firsthand was different. It made her think about all the people who went through similar situations without the power or resources to seek justice. She launched an initiative within ICE focusing on partnership and accountability with local law enforcement. She worked with the Department of Justice to develop new training programs for de-escalation and bias recognition. She testified before Congress about the need for better oversight and accountability mechanisms for police departments across the country. Some people criticized her, saying she was using her personal experience to push a political agenda. But Rebecca didn't see it that way. She saw an opportunity to turn something negative into something positive, to make sure that what happened to her on that highway led to real change. Lisa Martinez was promoted to detective 6 months after the incident. The department wanted to reward her intervention and make her a symbol of what good policing looked like. But Lisa struggled with the attention. She kept thinking about all the warning signs she'd missed with Brandon. The increasing aggression, the bitter comments, the edge in his voice. She started a peer support program within the department, encouraging officers to check in on each other, to notice when someone was struggling before it turned into something worse. She gave talks at the police academy about the importance of accountability and speaking up when you see something wrong. Brandon wasn't a bad person who became a cop, she told a class of recruits one day. He was a cop who let the job, and maybe life in general, turn him into someone he never meant to be. And the rest of us failed him by not noticing or by noticing and not saying anything. We owe it to ourselves, to our community, and to each other to be better than that. Brandon served his full 18 months. Prison was harder than he'd imagined, not because of violence or danger, but because of the monotony, the separation from everything he'd known, and the constant reminder of how far he'd fallen. He spent his time reading, exercising, and thinking about the choices that had led him there. He wrote a letter to Rebecca 4 months into his sentence. He didn't expect her to read it, much less respond, but he needed to say the things he hadn't been able to say in court. Director Chen, the letter began, I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't deserve your forgiveness. What I did to you that day was inexcusable. I let my ego and my anger turn me into everything a police officer should never be. You were right when you said that I should have treated you with respect regardless of who you were. Every person deserves that. And I failed in the most basic duty of my job and my humanity. I hope that whatever good comes from this situation, whatever changes are made because of what happened, can somehow balance out the harm I caused. I know it won't undo what I did, but maybe it can prevent it from happening to someone else. I'm sorry. Truly sorry. I will carry the weight of my actions for the rest of my life. Rebecca did read the letter. She didn't respond, but she kept it. Not as a trophy or a reminder of her victimhood, but as evidence that people can recognize their mistakes, even if recognition comes too late to prevent the consequences. When Brandon was released from prison, he moved to a small town in New Mexico where nobody knew his story. He got a job doing construction work, hard physical labor that left him too tired to think too much at night. His ex-wife had remarried, and his kids were polite but distant when he called. He'd lost the life he'd built, and he knew he'd never get it back. But he volunteered at a youth center talking to teenagers about making good choices and controlling your anger. He didn't tell them he was an ex-cop or an ex-convict unless they asked. He just tried to be an example of how one bad decision can change everything, and how you have to live with the consequences of your actions, no matter how much you regret them. 3 years after the incident, Rebecca was invited to speak at a national law enforcement conference. The auditorium was filled with police chiefs, sheriffs, and federal agents from across the country. She told them the story of what happened on that Arizona highway, not to shame or blame, but to illustrate a point. "The officer who assaulted me lost everything," she said. "His career, his family, his freedom. And I lost something too. I lost the sense of security I'd always felt, the assumption that a traffic stop was just a routine inconvenience. We both paid a price for his actions that day. But the real tragedy is that it didn't have to happen. If there had been better accountability systems, better mental health support for officers, better training in de-escalation, maybe that officer would have gotten help before he hurt someone. Maybe I wouldn't have a scar on my forehead. Maybe his children would still have their father in their lives." She paused, looking out at the sea of faces. "We can't change what happened, but we can learn from it. We can do better. We must do better, because every traffic stop, every interaction between law enforcement and the public is a chance to either build trust or destroy it. And trust once broken is incredibly hard to repair." The room erupted in applause, not because what she said was revolutionary, but because it was true and everyone there knew it. Years later, the incident on that Arizona highway would be taught in police academies as a case study in what not to do. Brandon's name would be mentioned as a cautionary tale. Rebecca's response would be held up as an example of grace under pressure and turning personal trauma into systemic change. And somewhere in New Mexico, Brandon would continue his quiet life, carrying the weight of his mistakes, hoping that somehow, in some small way, his failure might help prevent someone else from making the same choices he did. It wasn't redemption. It wasn't forgiveness. But it was all he had, and he'd learned to live with that.